In the last three modules, we focused on the market structure of monopoly. In this module, we are going to look at the third of four different types of market structures, and this one is called oligopoly. Oligopoly and the structure we will study after this one, monopolistic competition, are much more realistic and much more common forms of market structures than either monopoly or perfect competition. We discussed for a number of reasons why perfect competition is rare in the world. And in terms of monopoly, monopoly can exist, but except for natural monopolies, which are allowed with regulation in the United States, other forms of monopoly are prohibited and illegal under federal law. But oligopoly and monopolistic competition, therefore, become the most common forms of market structure that we find in our market economy today. So it's important that we understand them. But not only are they more common, but they're more complicated. Because with monopoly and perfect competition, it's very easy to graph them and find out that they determine their profit-maximizing quantity of output, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And while that's still true for oligopoly and monopolistic competition, it's much more difficult to graph because there are different behaviors that we have to examine and different outside impacts that affect the behavior of the firm in terms of the quantity that it will end up producing to try to maximize its profits. So, this module is going to focus on introducing you to the concept of oligopoly in the market. In this module, I will explain to you why oligopolists have an incentive to act in ways that actually reduce their combined profits, which seems odd, but will make sense after we look at it. And then I will explain why oligopolies can benefit from collusion, or working together to try to maximize their profits. Now, there are two terms that you're going to hear me using fairly frequently when describing oligopoly behavior. One is the term mutual interdependence, and the other one is price leadership. When you see either of those terms on the AP exam, and you most likely will see either or both of those terms, then be prepared to answer a question on oligopoly. Because mutual interdependence is only characteristic of oligopoly. And only under oligopoly do we find this concept of price leadership. So if you see those words being used, think oligopoly, because that's what you're answering a question about. Because this market structure is characterized by this type of interdependence amongst firms that are in this type of structure. So now we go back to our slide with the four different market models that exist, and now we're studying oligopoly. So what are the characteristics of oligopolies? Well, first, the market is identified by not many producers, as we saw under perfect competition, nor one producer only, making a unique product under monopoly. Here we have a few large producers that dominate the market. And by few, we don't have a specific number. There isn't one specific number. It could be 4, 5, or 6, but generally it's regarded as being fewer than 10 large producers that dominate the market. Now, one thing that is true is that sometimes they are selling identical products to each other, such as oil from oil companies, or they may be selling products that are differentiated from each other, such as Pepsi and Coca-Cola. They also face less competition because, like with monopoly, there are very high barriers to entry. And so when profits are being made and other firms want to enter the market to compete against them and make more profits, there are high barriers to entry that prevent those firms from entering. So because of this, they do have a significant degree over the control of the price that they charge. And therefore, once again, like monopolies, they are price makers rather than price takers. They don't have to take the market price as a given. But one characteristic that seems to be fairly unique amongst oligopolies is mutual interdependence. In other words, that the behavior of your competitor affects the outcome for you. So the decisions that you make will also affect your competitors. So there is mutual interdependence. Firms that compete with each other under oligopoly are dependent upon each other. And therefore, we're going to find that firms, when they try to maximize their profits, use a behavior that we call strategic pricing. Examples of oligopolies today might be the OPEC oil cartel, which is not really an oligopoly of firms, it's an oligopoly of countries. But OPEC stands for the oil producing exporting countries, and they are characterized by countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, and Venezuela, and other countries that dominate the oil market. Cereal companies like General Foods and General Mills are oligopolies. Car producers like Toyota, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Hyundai, and so forth, are part of an oligopoly as well. Because in each of these industries, the oil industry, the cereal industry, the auto industry, you find a few large companies that dominate the market. So, how do oligopolies occur and why do they exist? Well, oligopolies occur when only a few large firms start to control an industry. High barriers to entry keep other firms from entering even when profits are being made and they would like to enter the market. Well, what are these barriers to entry that we talk about? When we say there are high barriers to entry, what are these? They act as blockades, keeping other firms out. Well, one would be that economies of scale may exist in the industry. Now, we know that economies of scale exist when the increasing output leads to lower average total cost. And so one firm or fewer firms can produce at a lower average total cost than having many firms together, which would produce at a higher average total cost. And so if a new firm gets into the market, it will end up producing at a higher average total cost than the firms that are already there, and they won't be able to afford to compete. So, for example, the car industry is difficult to enter because only large firms can make cars at the lowest cost. Secondly, there may be very high startup costs. Think about the oil industry, the auto industry. Think about the computer industry or, the electric power industry. Things like that. You have very high capital costs in the beginning. Millions or billions of dollars that are needed just to get off the ground and start your company, because you have to buy very expensive capital to get started. And so that keeps a lot of companies out. Another high barrier to entry could be ownership of raw materials. There may be several firms that own a lot of or most of the inputs or raw materials that are needed to produce the good or service in this industry. And if they own most of the inputs, then other firms can't get in to compete because they can't purchase the inputs. So they may keep other firms out. Now in Module 57, the Introduction to Market Structure, I described oligopoly as a market structure with a few large producers. And even though there is no universal definition of how many producers must exist before we call the market an oligopoly, we can use measures like the Herfindahl index, which will be introduced later, or the concentration ratio of a market to quantify the market concentration. An additional key characteristic of oligopoly that I've already mentioned is that the firms are interdependent and engage in strategic behavior. Now, interdependence simply means that the actions of one firm, for example Honda, have an impact on another large firm, like Toyota, and vice versa. If Honda would choose to advertise during the Super Bowl, Toyota would be affected by that advertising, and they have to decide whether to respond and advertise also, or do nothing at all. These strategies and mutually interdependent outcomes make studying oligopoly both very interesting, but also very challenging. So let's begin with an example of what we call a duopoly. Instead of a few firms competing against each other, let's simplify it and say that there are only two large firms competing against each other. And when this happens, it's called a duopoly, and each firm is called a duopolist. And with only two firms in the industry, each realized that producing more, it would drive the market price down. Okay? So each firm would, like a monopolist, realize that profits would be higher for both of them if each of them limited their production of a particular good. So suppose there are only two gas stations in a small rural town of Boontucky. These gas stations, Margaret's Quickie Stop and Pam's Pump Station, are duopolists in the gasoline market, and they each sell 50% of all of the gas in town. The demand schedule for gasoline in Boontucky is given in the table that you see on the screen. Now, we will make a simplifying assumption, and we will assume that the marginal cost of selling a gallon of gas is equal to $1. If these station owners operated in a perfectly competitive world, price would be equal to marginal cost, and therefore they would sell their gasoline for $1 a gallon. In this case, the firms would split $1,400 of total revenue, because you can see from the table that if the price of gas was $1, 1,400 gallons would be sold, and total revenue would be $1,400, and therefore if you split it in half, each firm would be earning $700 apiece. But two sellers do not need to behave as perfectly competitive firms. Perhaps they could decide to collude. They could get together and they could agree that they weren't going to charge a price of $1, but that they would each charge a price of $4 per gallon to raise the revenue and profit for each one of them. And then each of them would sell 800 gallons, and you divide that in half, so each would get 400 gallons apiece. And at this collusive price, each firm would earn $3,200 divided in half, or $1,600 of total revenue instead of $700. Now, of course, because there are costs involved, the marginal cost equaled $1 per gallon, the total revenue earned is not the same as profit, but we can make the point to follow by focusing on the impact collusion and cheating has on total revenue. The thing is, if they did make such an agreement to charge $4 between the two of them instead of only $1, and they agreed not to compete with each other, would that agreement last? Well, sellers might choose to engage in collusion when they cooperate to raise each other's profits. Now, the strongest form of collusion is what we call a cartel. It's a formal agreement by several producers to obey output restrictions in order to increase their joint profits. But instead of colluding or joining a cartel, they could also choose to engage in non-cooperative behavior, and they could ignore the effects of their actions on each other's profits. So in a collusive agreement, Margaret and Pam would have agreed to only offer 400 gallons each at a price of $4 per gallon. This earns each gas station $1,600 in total revenue. But now suppose that Margaret does some quick calculations and sees that she can secretly break the agreement with Pam and sell an additional 100 gallons of gas, thus cheating on her agreement. Now what happens if she does that? Well, then there would now be 900 gallons sold, pushing the market price down to $3.50 a gallon. Margaret's total revenue would now be $3.50 times 500 gallons that she now sells, and that would equal $1,750, which is $150 more than under the agreement she had with Pam. But Pam's total revenue would now be $3.50 times the 400 gallons that she is selling, now at a lower price, which would give her $1,400, which would be $200 less than what they had originally agreed upon. So by cheating, Margaret would walk away with more revenue, and Pam would end up getting less. Now, how do you think Pam feels about this? Well, Pam is going to be ticked about it. And nobody wants Pam to get ticked, because now she's going to retaliate by cutting her price and selling more gas. Then Margaret will retaliate and drop her price even more. Pretty soon, they will keep doing that to each other until the price falls all the way back to where it equals marginal cost, or $1 per gallon, and these firms are now back to the competitive or non-cooperative outcome. Imagine how difficult it would be to maintain the collusive agreement if there were 5 or 10 gas stations in town instead of just 2. Each station would see an incentive to cheat on their agreement by producing a little more and getting a little more revenue and profit. And it would be more difficult to get caught. So each station would likely cheat. And if all firms cheat, the collusive profits or cartel profits tend to disappear. And it should be clearly noted that explicitly agreeing to collude on the basis of price and/or output is illegal in the United States. Firms and people can be fined and go to jail and prison for that. And they do get fined and imprisoned for doing so. So they can't do so explicitly or openly, and they can't even try to get away with it with a wink or a nod. It's difficult. So that's an important point to keep in mind. Collusive behavior by firms is illegal under federal law in the United States. And as I said, people and firms can be fined and go to prison for that. But in other parts of the world, in other countries, like in many European countries, it is more tolerated, and in some cases, it is actually legal. Now, by acting, if they were a single monopolist, oligopolists can maximize their combined profits. So they do have an incentive to engage in collusive behavior or act like a cartel like OPEC is, because they can increase their profits together and get more like a monopoly profit. But even when they do that, there is always the incentive for one firm to cheat and to produce more than they agreed to under the collusive or cartel agreement to increase that firm's profits. And when that happens, that firm gets more profit, but the others get less. And then they're tempted to cheat. And if they keep doing that to each other, then they drive the price all the way back down and eliminate those monopoly profits. This is what we mean when we say oligopolistic firms are mutually interdependent, that the behavior of one firm depends on the behavior of another firm. And each firm is affected by the behavior of other firms. And so this is just a kind of an explanation of the collusive agreement that I talked about previously with Margaret and Pam. So you may wish to kind of stop and review that again to understand how that works. Now, looking at another example, suppose the presidents of two lysine producers, which is an additive in animal feed and food, suppose they agree that each would produce 30 million pounds of lysine over the next year in order to maximize their combined profits. So they're limiting production. Instead of competing with each other, limiting their production to that amount to maximize their combined profits, so thereby reducing supply and raising the price. Well, even if they agreed to do that to maximize their combined profits, there's always an incentive for one of them to cheat. If one firm honored the agreement but the other cheated by increasing output, the price per pound, as we've already seen, would decrease. Total industry revenue would decline, but the cheating firm's profits would actually increase. But both firms' presidents could make the same calculation and both cheat, and if both firms increased production and cheat, each firm's profits would fall. You can see that here in the demand schedule for lysine. If you look at the total revenue column, you can see the total revenue is maximized at a price per pound of $6, where 60 million pounds of lysine would be produced. And if the firms were to engage in collusive behavior, that is the quantity they would want to produce, 60 million pounds at a price of $6. But when firms ignore the effects of their actions on each other's profits, they engage in non-cooperative behavior. And that's a choice they could make too. So they can make a choice to collude, or they could make a choice to engage in non-cooperative behavior. That's what makes understanding the behavior of oligopoly more complicated and more difficult, because we don't know whether they're going to engage in collusive behavior or non-cooperative behavior. We can't know that for sure. Now, it's likely to be easier to achieve informal collusion when firms in an industry face capacity constraints. In the above duopoly example that I gave, it didn't matter if Margaret cheated by selling 100 additional gallons or if she lowered the price of gasoline to $3.50. The outcome would have been the same. However, which choice is most likely to be immediately detected by Pam and punished? The price drop. These strategies between duopolists have been studied by economists for many years. Joseph Bertrand studied it in the 18th century, and he showed that when firms are selling an identical product, oligopolists will repeatedly lower price to undercut the competition. And this process will end at the perfectly competitive outcome where price is equal to marginal cost. Augustin Cournot studied it also in the 18th century, and he focused on quantity competition rather than price competition. Again, assuming a homogeneous product, duopoly firms choose output to maximize profit, given the output of the rival firm. There exists an equilibrium level of output that allows each firm to earn profits that are below monopoly level profits, but are above normal profits. In the late 1990s, there was a Swiss company named Rocha and a German company named BASF that secretly held talks about engaging in collusive behavior and price fixing in the vitamin market for vitamins like vitamin A and vitamin C. And they agreed to divide up the market for bulk vitamins that were sold mainly to other companies like food producers or animal feed producers that would buy these vitamins and put them in those foods and animal feed. And these were some of the world's largest drug companies, and they were involved in this huge conspiracy to rig the world vitamin market and to limit the supply of vitamins that they would produce, divide the market amongst themselves, and keep prices high. Now, eventually, some other big companies got in on the game too. And one of the companies, which wanted to merge with a company here in the United States, was afraid that they would get caught, and so they kind of opened up to the Justice Department here in the United States and made investigators aware of what was going on. And then eventually an investigation was conducted and they got caught. But how could this have happened? Well, the main answer probably lies in different national traditions about how to treat oligopolists. Oligopolistic behavior is becoming increasingly illegal in European countries, but for a long time it's been much more tolerated, and in some countries legal, whereas it's been illegal in the United States for over 100 years. Let's watch this video now on collusion.
Monopoly, that is collusion. When the firms collude, they have agreements not to compete. The firms agree to a specified price that will be charged and the quantity of the product that each will produce. By agreeing as a group to reduce output, they can charge the higher monopoly price. Firms that collude in this way have formed a cartel. The issue with such agreements is that they're inherently unstable. Once a monopolistic price is set, individual firms have incentive to cheat, to raise production above their designated level. What is the incentive to cheat? Pre-collusion, each firm has marginal revenue equal marginal cost. Post-collusion, now each firm produces a smaller quantity at a higher price. That is, now marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. So we're no longer at the profit maximizing level for the firm. The individual firm then has the incentive to alter its behavior such that marginal revenue equals marginal cost again. It will lower price slightly and sell more product. Eventually, the other partners realize that their customers are drawn away, but there's no way to openly punish the cheating firm since the entire activity is illegal. In the end, the cartel usually falls apart. Cartels are not the only way in which competition can be reduced. This is why the government also takes a hand in mergers and it has antitrust laws.
Here's an activity that we will be doing in class on oligopoly and collusion. And here is the summary screen that summarizes what we've learned about oligopoly in this module. This ends our look at Module 64, Introduction to Oligopoly.